Evet değerli konuklarımız, Sermaye Piyasaları Kongresi 2018 CFA Society İstanbul sponsorluğunda Bana bu kalemi sat paneliyle devam edecek. Panelimizin konu başlıkları yurt dışı satışa aracılık yapan yatırım bankası temsilcilerinin beklentileri, önem verdikleri hususlar, analiz yöntemleri ve yabancı yatırım bankacılarının gözünden ihraçlar olacak. Bana bu kalemi sat panelinin moderatörü CFA Avrupa, Orta Doğu ve Afrika Yönetim Direktörü Sayın Gary Baker. Buyurun. Sayın Baker, yerine otururken ben de değerli konuşmacıları sizlere takdim etmek istiyorum. İş, Yatırım, Menkul Değerler Anonim Şirketi Sağlık, Ulaştırma, Turizm ve Hizmetlerden sorumlu Kurumsal Finansman Müdürü Sayın Kaan Kırtay. Citigroup Sermaye Piyasaları Başkanı Sayın Roger Barb. CFA Yapı Kredi Yatırım Menkul Değerler Anonim Şirketi Sermaye Piyasaları Grup Müdürü Sayın Sadık Çulcuoğlu. Sayın konuşmacılarımız da yerini aldığına göre ben sözü Sayın Gary Baker'a bırakıyorum. Buyurun.
Okay, thank you very much and good morning, I think just about. In a second, I'll just ask the panelists just to introduce themselves. My name is Gary Baker. I am Managing Director for Europe, Middle East and Africa for CFA Institute. Also probably relevant for this panel is I spent 25 years as an equity analyst working for mainly Merrill Lynch for 20 years, really trying to convince people to buy things that we had to sell. So that is one of the themes of this panel that we want to get into in a second. But before we get into that, could I just ask the panelists just to a little bio so you understand the range of talent and expertise that we have on the panel today?
Thank you, Gary. So first of all, I need to say I'm very happy. I feel very happy and privileged to be here in front of these great attendees and together with these great panelists. And I'd like to thank the Capital Markets Board and all the sponsors for enabling such a conference, such a panel. So my name is Kaan Kırtay. After spending a few years in business consulting, this is my 16th year in investment banking. I am the head of healthcare, transportation, services team in each investment. So I wish good luck.
Hi everyone, my name's Roger Barb. I'd like to echo Kaan's thoughts. It's a real privilege to be here and it's so lovely to see the event so well attended. It's nice to know that there's real enthusiasm for Turkey and the capital markets. I'm a 30-year veteran of Citigroup. I work in the equity capital markets business. I'm not a member of the CFA Institute yet, but I'm passionate about serving my clients nonetheless.
Thank you. My name is Sadık Çulcuoğlu. I am head of capital markets advisory at Yapı Kredi Yatırım. We basically originate and execute equity and debt capital markets product in both domestically and international markets. Proudly, I can say I'm part of CFA. I'm a CFA charter holder and member of Istanbul Security Analyst Society, and happy to be here.
Okay, thank you. Right, let's get straight into it. Now, the theme of the panel is really, can you sell me this pen? That's what the broad message. But really, what we want to do is break it up into a three-act play. First of all, it's just to level set. We're talking really about how attractive and the options available for Turkish companies selling themselves to international investors or domestic investors. And how do you develop that story? How do you go about putting your best foot forward, your best story forward? So to do that, what I wanted to do was just do three things. One is to establish the initial process, everyone is on the same page about what an IPO process looks like, who's involved. Secondly, how do you develop the story to make that attractive story for an international investor in particular? And then thirdly, we just want to touch on some of the challenges, not least technology, going back to the keynote speech as to what might change going forward. Now, to do that, we have approximately 32 minutes. So It's going to be a bit of a whiz through, but we will try and keep the responses quite short, and we'll get through as much as we can. So without further ado, if I could ask Roger first off, just to sort of set the scene of IPO process, who are the characters involved, what are the key roles that we're really talking about here?
Thank you, Gary. So whenever I think about an IPO process, I'm reminded of a story. It's when you go to the doctor and he picks up this elephant-sized syringe and says, this really isn't going to hurt. And you think, oh, really? Well, the IPO process is a 3 to 4 month journey. It really doesn't hurt that much, but it does take a lot of time. It's very intensive, and it's essentially structured around trying to sell your story to the capital market. So the first question is going to be to the company, and what the company needs to bring to the table before we even start work is the company has got to have a great strategy and a business plan, a real vision as to what they're going to sell and the story they're going to tell to the market. And the CEO and the CFO in particular need to get ready for the fact that they're going to spend the next 3 to 4 months basically as salesmen on the road, either in front of bankers or eventually in front of investors, telling this story and trying to get people really enthused about the opportunity that they are presenting to them. Now, you're going to have an army of advisors. They're going to help you through this process, and to try to explain it now would be impossible. But the good news is that there are a couple of appointments which are going to be critical to the success of the overall deal. And if you can pick 1 or 2 advisors who you really trust, who can hold your hand right the way through what is going to feel complicated and baffling, then you don't need to worry too much about the details. So the first thing I'd say is you have to pick 1 law firm who you really trust to help you. Pick an issuer's counsel who you really, really believe in. And the second thing is make sure that you trust your bankers, because it's very difficult to get through the process if you don't believe in the advice that you're going to be given. And that between your bankers and your counsel, they will help you cope with 3 to 4 months worth of accountants who are going to help you get the numbers right, prospectus drafting to make sure we get the story right, regulators who are going to tell you what you can and can't say in the interest of protecting investors, and then everything investors are going to want to know, which I can guarantee you is going to be an awful lot more than the regulators are going to want you to say. So I think, Gary, I'd leave it there, but...
No, that's a good start. I mean, maybe we can sort of develop that a little bit, Sadiq. So given that as a backdrop, I mean, you know, if you're a vendor looking at this, a company, what do you think the key challenges and decisions you've got to take? What goes into that process of deciding?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I think it's really important for everybody, all the stakeholders, to acknowledge the fact that basically this is not just a one-time transaction, that you sell your company and basically it's a done deal. That's quite a wrong way to think about this, and basically the right way of thinking about it is that this is just a process, this is an access to capital markets, and once you are there, basically it opens up new horizons for you. There could be potential for follow-on transactions going forward. Why is this important, particularly for us? I mean, in Turkey, basically, it's in our culture. We love to negotiate. And I think there are lots of negotiation opportunities throughout this process. But it's important from the start, especially if there are multiple groups of shareholders, for them to get aligned across this common purpose is really critical. I think this is really a bulk of most of these challenges around here. And later on, when you start the process, as Roger mentioned, there is all sort of coordination issues. There is all sort of, this is a daunting task, basically. There are multiple parties that are involved. At the same time, you are running your own company. So probably you need to have a task force on this project and manage around. And also markets are really volatile, another challenge there. I mean, you have a timeline in your mind, but at the end of the day, things happen, maybe even not market-related, things like fat fingers, which have happened. We have issues basically experienced that in Turkey. So there is certain element of luck and psychology that needs to be managed. And at the end, yeah, I think, again, one of the challenges is really, even after the deal, once you get your funds and the deal is closed, it's not over. It's actually pretty much start of your story. So you need to really keep in mind that right now, all public investors are now again your shareholders, so you have to put in place investor relations people in line and basically really transparent policies going forward.
Just leading on from that, the investor relations portion is an interesting one. Certainly as an ex-equity analyst, I mean, a lot of my contact with the company, partly in the IPO, but certainly afterwards, was via investor relations department. And Kalemi, maybe can you talk about that in terms of that, the key process of setting that up, getting that in place, how early that happens, how important that role is as well?
Yeah. Well, this is one of the most popular topics, we discuss with our, companies, issuers. They ask us, when shall we put him in place? With a world of no constraints, I mean, I would say definitely right now. Whenever you decide on when to do an IPO or to do an IPO, you have to hire him. But is this still, real life? Of course, no. And when we look at it from a, legal perspective, CMB says, Capital Markets Board says, you have 6 months after your, shares start trading. So is it good to wait until this deadline? Of course, no. I mean, it's too late. So we would all agree, IR is one of the vital parts of communication program because it brings in the compliance as well as the communication with the investors. So practically, in practice, what happens is, once the shareholders have an understanding, have a signal of that this IPO will be priced, I think we need to put him in his place. So when this happens is right after the pilot fishing. So after the pilot fishing, probably the shareholders would be confident that they would be doing the IPO. There are still risks, but it would be nice to have in place. So how does he help us? He helps us in 2 ways. One, he's used to this. He knows to deal with Capital Markets Board, the other regulatory bodies, and he's knowledgeable about the process. And second, he is good with the investors. I mean, he probably knows the investors before, and the investors know him. So the sooner we get him on the table, the easier things will be for us. So, after the IPO, of course, there are his regular duties, like, issuing the financials, having the press conferences, the investor conferences, then, do the briefings, but most importantly, and probably solve the conflicts with the investors, upon some unwanted, let's say, announcements, disclosures of the companies.
We'll come back to conflicts in a second,
Yeah.
but okay, so the decision's taken, company seems happy that, right, this is something we want to do. Now, clearly at that point, there are still a lot of options available, domestic versus international, and a variety of international options. So, Roger, can you just talk through some of those options that are available for that capital raising exercise?
Yeah, with pleasure. So I am delighted to be able to tell this room that I sincerely believe that Istanbul is a deep, mature, liquid stock market, and certainly when you're dealing with the international investor community, the days when we used to feel that you had to have a GDR, you had to have a London listing in order to be able to address the investor community, those days are long gone. Those days are long, long gone. And these days, apart from the fact that you capture all of the domestic demand when you list in Istanbul, apart from the fact that you have access to the retail market, there are very few global investors with a focus on Turkey, on emerging markets, on the themes that are relevant in this market, who cannot get comfortable with a listing in Turkey. So is there any discussion to be had at all? Well, I think there is. There is one market in particular where I think there is an additional element to be borne in mind, which is the London market. And I don't want to talk about GDRs here. What I want to talk about briefly is the concept of a premium listing. You may have heard of a premium listing. It's a sort of a super gold standard in London for standards of corporate governance, for standards of disclosure. It comes with a lot of extra cost in terms of getting ready. It comes with a lot of extra corporate governance in running yourself. So why, you might say to me, would I even bother thinking about this? And the answer, and this goes a little bit back to something that Paul was talking about in our earlier session, is that there is a large body of money in London which will only invest in premium listed company. And there is a large body of money which follows certain indices, and it's only by being on the premium list in London that you are eligible to be included in those indices. So if you're a large company looking at doing a large IPO, I would encourage you to have a debate with your advisors about whether there may be some incremental value in potentially listing on the premium list in London as well. But the main headline for today is Istanbul is absolutely internationally regarded as the deep local market for any Turkish story.
That's good to hear. Good to be here, and good to hear that that's a message. Sadiq, one of the interesting ones and one of the frustrations that I certainly had personally as an analyst was when we have dual track processes going on, and lo and behold, the day that you think pricing is going to happen, it's announced that the company's been sold privately to a corporation. I mean, how do you handle that? Do you recommend that companies, do you like dual track processes? How do you think about that as an option?
Of course. So obviously, that's been a trend, basically, not only in Turkey market, but that's a trend that we see in other markets as well. Companies, particularly if the IPO is a shareholder sell down, a secondary offering, typically, and if there is a financial sponsor, private equity firm is involved, that typically comes up to discussion whether go through a dual track process. I mean, one thing, as we have been mentioning about this IPO process, the challenges about the IPO process is it's a lengthy process. Let's say 4 to 6 months, and you may not necessarily know where the markets are headed. So one of the things to keep in mind and have your advisors in your team is basically offer you different perspectives throughout this process. And things might not turn out that public equity is not an alternative anymore because of the market's conditions. Then, if you are prepared and you have been discussing with, let's say, some of the strategic investors that could be a potential buyer, then you might have an option and you are not losing for 6 months of time. So I don't see it as a negative sort of process with regards from an issuer standpoint, definitely. It's just because it helps actually companies to start this route, because sometimes it's harder for them to pull the trigger. They don't believe in markets. Right now, honestly, when we talk to clients, they say, okay, the world is heading to a different direction. We are not so sure. There are all sorts of challenges. Why should we start this daunting process right now? We can say, you know what? Let's start as a dual track process, and let's see, maybe let's get prepared. And if markets are open and if it's to your advantage, you'll go through IPO route. And, but obviously, it needs to be well managed. I agree with you. I mean, preferably the deal, if a certain decision is made before the deal goes public, it's a preferred way to go, so that you manage the expectations. You don't have investors done all the work, preparatory work, and during the last couple of days of book building, that could be sometimes disappointing for investors. But at the end of the day, these are all, I think, for the better health of the market. I think this is a very good process.
Just moving on to the sort of stories, themes, if we look at actual appetite in the market at the moment, I mean, Khan, maybe a question you could take, just this construction of the actual story itself. I mean, are there particular sectors or themes that you think are particularly interesting, relevant, important at this stage? And conversely, are there some stories or areas that you do not think there is demand for?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, the equity story itself is the soul of an IPO. I mean, it's the fundamental of an IPO. It's like the vision statement, it's like the mission statement of a company who try to convince the investors on the rationale on why they should invest on the stocks. So it's everything. Well, we as the investment bankers, help the companies word these, put these into words, but frankly speaking, the essence of it must be within the company. So if there is no strategy of the company, if there is no idea in the company, then we really lack it. I mean, the idea must be behind, in the roots of the company, because it helps us in, you know, understanding marketability of this IPO, as well as the pricing at the end of the day. We have to convince the shareholders on what prices, on what valuation this could be done. And investors are demanding, at the time being, you know, from Turkish equity stories, they expect more of like growth, like in any emerging markets, as well as some deleveraging. They want the integrity, they want the markets, your company, the, you know, strategy of your company, your shareholders' ability to do it, to be aligned, and they want you to focus on what you need to do with the IPO proceeds after the IPO. So when we are, you know, trying to build up an equity story, we look at three basic points. One, what is the market? How big is the market? Is it a promising market? And within this market, is it a promising company? Does it have a good strategy, good, you know, model to operate and to overcome rivalry? This is very important to explain. If you fail this, well, it ends from the beginning. Two, the talent bench. If the managers, if the, you know, the ones who will follow this strategy, who will, you know, apply this strategy to the company is not there, if the company lacks it, then it's not success, because they trust in the managers, the management of the company, to enable this happen. So, you know, experience is very important. And the third very important point is the financials and the peers. While, you know, analysts or investors, you know, try to understand the company, they look at the financials, the KPIs, they look at the peers, they look at, you know, in which markets such companies maintain success. Will you be able to maintain this success after the IPO, after, you know, things start running with the new investors? And, you know, if they cannot see it all together in integrity, it will not work, it will fail.
You mentioned use of proceeds there, and I mean, it's quite a topical issue, I suppose, in Turkey at this point. And Roger, I mean, a couple of questions here. One, is it legitimate, you think, or a strong enough story to say we're raising equity to de-lever? And secondly, you know, sort of related, I mean, there previously was always a little bit of a stigma about companies coming out of private equity hands onto public markets as to whether there was any value left for investors. And is that still the case? Is there still some nervousness or reluctance on the part of investors in that situation?
All right, those are very, very good questions, very fair, very topical. So let's start with the use of proceeds question, and the question is, you know, is it okay to come to the market and say, well, I'm not going to build a new factory, I'm not going to expand into a new country, all I'm going to do is take my balance sheet from position A to position B and reduce the debt. And I'm going to do, I guess, what do they call it, a politician's answer. I'm not going to quite answer the question in the form it's been asked. I think the way an investor looks at any story is they say to themselves, first of all, do I have an opportunity to gain exposure to these themes, to this sector, to this kind of story in some other way? And so the first thing you've got to say to yourself is, how easy is it for an investor to replicate the kind of story which I'm selling? And the reason why I say this is because if you are the only opportunity for somebody to gain exposure, for example, to I don't know, consumer retail growth in Turkey, then you're playing from a pretty strong hand in terms of getting people to follow you. And then the next question becomes, well, what am I actually doing here? So if you are competing heavily because there are hundreds of other listed companies who offer the same exposure, then obviously you want to be telling a story which is more dynamic and more exciting than all of the other guys. And in those kind of circumstances, being able to tell a story which is about accelerating growth or accelerating profitability is going to be that much more arresting. On the other hand, companies who have a bad balance sheet, companies who have a severe currency mismatch in terms of their liability profile, are going to face an uphill struggle. And so if you've got a good story and you've got a good management team, and the fact of the matter is you need the proceeds because you want to make sure that your liabilities are denominated in lira and your income is denominated in lira, and nobody can worry about your repayment profile or currency mismatch, for example. If that just happens to be the story, if it just happens to be that you want to reduce the level of debt from something which was consistent with private ownership but isn't healthy for the public markets, then don't worry, that is fine. What investors will focus on is who's the management team, what's the growth story, am I excited about this, and is it coming at the right price? So I don't know if that answers the question, Gary, but I would encourage people to have the courage of their convictions and to bring a story to the market which they believe is the right one, and let the market take it from there. And I've got to be honest and say I spoke for so long I've completely forgotten what the second question was.
Private equity ownership coming onto public markets.
How could I forget? Private equity, yes. Well, private equity, I think there was a time when people were very worried about this. There was a time when people were worried about this, but I honestly think that private equity have become such a feature of the growth story for companies as they go from those initial faltering steps to being an established public market. They may go through 2 or 3 rounds of private equity ownership. I honestly think people are, well, I don't want to say over it, but I sort of do want to say over it at the same time. I mean, people will, they understand what a company needs to look like. They're capable of doing their homework. They will be cautious, but they will analyze a company on its own merits. And in a funny way, I almost feel like private equity ownership is a stamp of quality.
Yeah.
Because if they had a private equity owner, there is no question that they are going to know how to report their numbers. There's no question that they're going to know how to keep track of their liquidity, that their balance sheet is going to be under control, and they will have been disciplined in terms of the way they manage themselves. So I would go so far as to say, done right, private equity ownership actually can be a real stamp of approval. And for a company coming from a country like Turkey, I think there are international investors who would say, look, it's great that you've had a private equity owner. I feel good about this story.
Sadi, just continuing that theme perhaps on the pools of available investors. You know, we've talked a little bit about international, domestic, but do you think that the private equity is now a very legitimate competing source of capital as well? You know, public markets in some ways are losing out to that. They have been in terms of the pools of capital in private becoming ever larger. What's your sense of that as to those available pools and where companies are being drawn towards at this point, in Turkey in particular?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a bigger trend globally. We see some companies going to the private route because availability of private capitals. Even some public companies going to private, becoming private. There are so much example stories around that. But when it comes to Turkey, I think it's not necessarily a competing platforms yet. So when a company, typically when they are thinking about a public raising capital through public markets, it's not necessarily something that's in competition to private market because they come into different stages, typically in Turkey. But what's encouraging, I think, is for private equity investors is basically now that last year and 2017, they have exited through public markets. So it actually for them attracts, I think, bigger private equity funds because the availability of public market as an alternative exit platform. So I think that's important. But really, we haven't seen the other way around. We haven't really seen like these all, like Tesla kind of stories that a public company in Turkey is thinking about, well, the reporting requirements are too much burden for me, I'm going to go to the private route. Not really, because in Turkey, what we lack is institutional investor base, so we really value whether it's in private capital form or public capital form, and there are so many larger opportunities than the capital itself, so we are not really competing, but we are trying to basically reach out as much public or private capital as possible.
Okay. Right, we're going to change tack a little bit now. It's all been quite straightforward and and interesting and on the same page in terms of the process of deciding pools of available capital linking to investors. What I want to examine briefly is just some of the conflicts, the inherent conflicts in the deal process. And Khan, if you will, can you talk about the role of the equity analyst in that? Because, I mean, that's often the conduit between the company, investor, investment bank. You know, for example, you know, who is the analyst representing you? You still analyzing the company? You're looking out for investor interests, or how do you see it from that banking perspective?
Yeah, well, they have a very, very important role, to be frank. I mean, they have the hardest role, and it's a very important role. You know, once a company is, you know, public, everybody talks about it, everybody has an opinion. But before it goes to an IPO, before it's public, you're alone there. The company management tries to explain in an analyst presentation form, you know, what's going in this IPO, what's going in this company. They tell you about macro environment, they tell you about the, you know, company itself, the strategy, but you're all alone there. You know, you represent being independent, and it's a tough role because you need to be convinced with the story, and it must not be a high flyer story. You know, it needs to be balanced. So you need to do the analysis. You need to, you know, understand this story, understand the data, look at the public records, you know, look at the peers, understand the peers in the markets, and try to find a way in evaluating the company, express it, you know, very plainly in your research report, and send it to investors, which would help them in understanding your financial predictions as well as your guidance for valuation. Okay, this is a, you know, very important role, because at the end of the day, the company management tries to affect you because they know you're the source of valuation. The banks, you know, we have strict policies. You know, we have strict Chinese laws. We cannot even talk to them most of the time. So we want them to understand this story very well. You know, we don't want them to misunderstand or go in a wrong way or in the wrong direction. And investors, they always want to make money, and that's a great conflict, as you have mentioned. You know, they're always in between. They have to do their job very good, or otherwise, you know, such an independence may result, you know, in bad times. So it requires great analysis, great know-how, and, you know, there are two parts to this story, like the international researchers who have global industry coverages, who may know the industries very well, who knows the peers, who knows what happens in such, you know, businesses, but they may lack the local macro environment, you know, local traditions. And then if it's the first time IPO in that industry, in that market, then the local analysts may miss the peers, may miss how it went, you know, in other capital markets. So he has to work really hard. It's a tough job.
Agreed. Just continuing the theme of conflicts, Roger, there clearly is at best a triangulation going on here between issuer, advisors, market, investors. I mean, who is responsible for managing that potential conflict or reaching agreement?
Gary, I think it's a really difficult question to answer in a comprehensive fashion. I guess there are two themes that come to mind when I think about this. One is transparency, and the other is flexibility. So if we go back to what an IPO is, it's a 4-month journey. I think one of the real challenges for any issuer is you have no idea what the outcome is going to be when you embark on that journey, and you don't really get visibility on it until right towards the end. And that perception of has there been a conflict or not, I think often comes down to how people feel about the final result of the transaction. And do they feel they got the value they got deserved? And do they feel they got the distribution they wanted? And do they feel they got the commitment from their advisors that they needed in terms of engaging with the investor base? And that's why I say flexibility is key. I mean, we've seen markets move quite sharply in a number of directions just over the last 3 to 4 months, and so you could imagine how that might affect a transaction when you start at one place and you think, what do I reasonably expect to be the situation when we market these equities today? And then 4 months go by, and there's economic noise, there's geopolitical noise, and the markets can just be in a different place by the time you get to marketing. So the first thing I would say is I think people need to be flexible and understanding about the fact that we're working towards an objective, but we're working against a moving background, and where we may come out at the end is not necessarily the same thing. And what you need is to feel comfortable that people are showing up and working hard and doing the best job they can. The second thing that I think we can do about conflicts is to have transparency. And one of the nice things about recent developments in the way IPOs get marketed is that we're spending more and more time in front of investors earlier in the process. And sharing that feedback from investors directly with issuers so that they don't feel that it's been intermediated, they don't feel that anyone's had a chance to apply a filter, I think is incredibly valuable in that regard. And I think it's helpful for issuers to feel confident that they know what they're getting into as they go through each sequential stage of the process. So that transparency, coupled with a sort of a flexibility and an understanding of the nature of the game, you know, I think that's the best way of approaching it. And it's why I said right at the outset, appoint bankers and legal advisors who you trust, because you're going to need that trust as you go through the journey.
No, good answer. I mean, one more step in that process, though, is Sadiq, perhaps you could address this. That I think it's clear where the advisors stand on this, representing the issuer. Who is representing the investor in this process? Do they need more obvious representation, or is it up to them as institutional, professional investors? It's how they go about it. Is anyone specifically representing their interests and alignment?
Well, that's actually a tougher question than the previous one, but I'll try. I know actually CFA Institute is also, that is among the topics, whether this IPO process really is watching investors' interests, because it's relatively, I can say probably it hasn't really changed much throughout last decades. Looking at some of the other areas of financial markets, there is lots of innovation in place. But frankly speaking, I think this is one of those processes, as Roger has mentioned, the involvement of investors is really the key here. Early on, involvement of investors are really the important factor here. So there, I think it itself kind of helps managing some of the issues and the transparency in the process again. For instance, we have seen this, I think, in Aston Martin's IPO in Europe. There were unconnected analysts were involved for the first time. I'm not sure how it was received in the market, but from what I follow, it's again a step in the right direction in a sense that you are having people not involved in the process voicing their opinion through research and sharing with investors. This might bring some transparency. We actually have this process in Turkey. Our Turkish regulator requires us, basically the lead managers, to write a price discovery report, sort of basic assumptions that's underlying the pricing, and they require other parties to comment on it and publish those comments. So this is a step towards, I think, increasing the transparency, involving other people's unrelated to the transaction and give out their opinions. You can still argue whether those opinions are objective or not, but still reading through those pages, and investors have this watchful eye, obviously, they can understand, they can have a better sense of where the valuation is, and which is typically where the tensions are around, basically, in this process. So I think from a regulatory standpoint, there are steps in the right direction for sure.
I'm afraid that our time is almost up, because being bankers, they have to catch aeroplanes. Maybe one word from each of them in terms of just a thought to think about to either companies or issuers out there. What are the most important things to think about? Just a very quick comment from each of you, and then we'll end it at that point. So, Kaan?
Yeah, well, first of all, we shall start with the issuer. I mean, after an IPO, you have to be aware that you're not alone. I mean, you also represent your investors. You have to understand the story behind what will go afterwards, after an IPO. You have to stick with your promises because IPO is just the beginning. It's starting a career. So it's very important on how to decide on it and then how to proceed, go with it.
Okay. Roger?
Just one thought. Call us. But
Teed it up.
I think more seriously, I would say nobody is going to tell your story as well as you are. It's about you. It's about your story. We need to believe in you. You've got to be right at the front of it. So that's what I would say. This is about you. You need to be championing your story, and you need advisors who give you an opportunity to tell your story to the right audience.
And don't get discouraged basically by the market news. We have seen this so many times in Turkey. Turkey is basically experiences lots of volatility, but the IPO windows in a blink of an eye can open. So start your prep work early on. Call us even now, earlier than when you were thinking, and get prepared.
Look, there are so many other things we could talk about on technology, on future state, future models, pressure on fees. But please join me to thank our panelists for their contributions, and thank you for your patience. Thank you.
Evet efendim, değerli konuklarımızı bir kez daha sahneye davet etmek istiyorum. Konuşmacılarımıza teşekkür ediyoruz. Kısa bir süre kendilerini sahnede misafir edeceğiz. Sermaye Piyasaları Kongresi 2018'e katkı ve katılımlarından dolayı CFA Society İstanbul Başkan Yardımcısı Sayın Ertunç Tümen kendilerine teşekkür plaketlerini takdim edecekler. Buyurun lütfen. Evet. Şimdi bu panelden sonra 1 saat öğle yemeği aramız olacak, ancak bu salonda ara olmayacak. Birazdan size hatırlatacağım. Genç fütüristlerin gözüyle gelecek paneli A salonunda, yani burada siz değerli konuklarımızla birlikte değerli konuşmacılarımızı ağırlayacağız burada. Ve CFA Society İstanbul sponsorluğunda gerçekleşti panelimiz. Video ile birlikte bitiriyoruz paneli.
Let's build a better world for investing.
Let's always put our clients' needs before our own.
Let's have honest conversations.
Let's have candid debates about what retirement savings really mean.
Let's dispel false hopes.
And build real dreams.
Let's stand by our clients' side as the world around them changes.
Let's have the courage to take the long view.
Let's hold ourselves to the highest standards of ethics.
Let's build a better world for investing.
One charter holder at a time.
That's what we do.
That's what I do.
That's what I do every day.
I'm a CFA charter holder.
I am a CFA charter holder.
I'm a CFA charter holder. I measured up.
I measured up.
My name is Anna Toshik.
Je m'appelle Christine Philpott.
Et mio nome è Michael Libia.
My name is Paul Smith.
My name is Colin McLean.
And I'm building a better world for investing.
CFA Institute. Let's measure up.